It is time for our next panel discussion. We do need to get into it if we can. Our next panel discussion is on harnessing and empowering environmentally conscious athletes to use their voices to inspire climate change action. As mentioned earlier this morning, we're not going to go through every speaker profile because they are in your programs and you would have received those digitally as well. If you need to have a look at them, you can still use the QR code that's on your table to find out a little bit more about the background of all of our panel members and speakers today. However, we will introduce them up onto stage. It's going to be led by the AFLW player for St Kilda Footy Club and also decarbonising sport lead FrontRunners, and she's an absolute legend. A big round of applause, please, for our lead in this panel discussion, Nicola Barr. Nick's going to be joined by the CEO of Cricket for Climate, Joanne Bowen. CEO of Footy for Climate, Alexi Lynch. Representing the Professional Footballers Association, Emma Checker. And Australian Olympic race walker, Rhydian Cowley. Big round of applause for our next panel as they make their way up.
Thanks, Pete. And unlike Sheila, I don't have any quotes for you or any meditation, so hopefully you're all feeling really relaxed already. But I did want to also begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of this land, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and also acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. And I just wanted to start off by saying, as a footy player, this is a really special place to be at the MCG. I was born in Melbourne into a St Kilda family. My uncle even played for the Saints, so coming back here after 8 years at the Giants feels like coming home. We don't get to play much at the G in the AFLW, but we know what it stands for: community, connection, and the power of sport to bring people all together. And I guess that power really hit home for me during the Black Summer bushfires. I remember smoke rolling over our Western Sydney training ground and it felt apocalyptic. And not long after, I connected with Jasper Pittard and Tom Campbell, who are the two co-founders of Footy for Climate, and Emma Pocock and the team at FrontRunners, and started looking at how sport and athletes can drive climate action. And that's what this panel is all about today, how we can encourage and empower athletes to use their platform to make a difference. There will be some time for questions at the end, hopefully. If I haven't run out of time, I'll get told if I have. So have a think about what you might want to ask our amazing panellists today. Our first guest has decades of experience centred in sustainability and climate change, from local government to international and global roles. His back catalogue actually makes him the perfect CEO of Footy for Climate and one excellent panel guest. So thank you, Lex. Our next guest is a leader in climate and sustainability known for bold net zero solutions and her work with the Climate Leaders Coalition. Now the CEO of Cricket for Climate, she's all about people, impact and driving real change. Thank you, Joanne Bowen. And from debuting for the Matildas at 16 to leading A-League teams and playing across Europe and Asia, Emma has lived and breathed elite football. Now off the pitch, she brings that same energy to infrastructure projects and sports governance. Thank you, Emma. And finally, he's a 3-time Olympian and fresh off a bronze medal at the Paris 2024 Games. And he's just committed to the planet as he is to the podium. A proud climate advocate, BBC award-winning eco-athlete and a leader on and off the track. Thank you, Rhydian. So, Emma, this is a panel all about empowering athletes to talk about climate. So I wanted to start off with you just to hopefully give the room today a bit of a glimpse into what life is like just generally as a professional athlete. I know you've reminded me you're retired now, but, athletes face a lot of expectation and pressures, and I just thought it'd be great for you to give an overview of actually what it's like.
Yeah, I think it's a big question to answer because I think it's only something that you can truly understand when you're in the situation. And I think unlike, I know there's a lot of work pressures no matter what industry you work in, no matter the role, but that pressure to be at your best every single day, I think is a unique one to professional sport. And that knowing that if you are subpar, it's actually not enough sometimes. So when you live and breathe that expectation and pressure, not only of your teammates, the coaches, but, stakeholders, fans, and sometimes a nation, it's a lot to have to wake up and live up to every single day. And I think especially as time goes on, that pressure is getting greater and greater now that sport is growing, and especially in women's sport. With the growth that we've seen recently, growth brings more pressure. There's more eyes on you. There's more people knowing what you're doing, and especially now that we have social media, everyone knows your every move. So I think for a professional athlete, it's a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think alongside all of that pressure and the expectation, it can then be really difficult sometimes to speak up about things like climate. And I know when we were speaking last week, you sort of talked about the fact that if you are speaking up about things like climate, occasionally your teammates might question you, or you might feel like your coach doesn't think that you're all in on what you're trying to achieve with sport. Can you talk to us a little bit about that tension and how you've managed that over your career?
It's tough because I think there's this underlying view that if you're not 100% focused on your performance, that you're not there for the right reasons. And I think it is starting to change slowly, and especially now that more athletes want to, be their own person, have their own views and outwardly share them to generate change. But it's still a difficult space, and I've personally experienced that with a number of issues, and climate being one of them. And it took a lot for us with the PFA to get the green rounds up and running. It's difficult working with people who, one, don't understand, or two, don't care. And I think for athletes to hold strong in their views is still, one that has a lot of barriers.
Yeah, absolutely. Rhydian, I'll come to you. Was there a moment for you where you came to climate advocacy, and do you think that in your career so far, you've had a very successful career, that it's helped or hindered your performance?
So I suppose similar to you, Black Summer, it's really, if you were on the East Coast, you couldn't escape it. And then having that followed straight up basically by COVID pandemic was just that, I think, combination of holy crap, climate change is here now. It's not something that's some far off issue that someone else will solve. And then having just suddenly that extra time that comes from being sitting at home for weeks because you've got to be careful of this new virus that's going around. That was a real catalyst for me to, think about how I could, as an athlete, be a bit more involved in responding to climate change and making climate action actually happen, and diving into that. And I suppose initially it was a little bit of I don't know if anyone else is thinking about sport and climate action, and it turns out there's a whole bunch of people that have and had been thinking about it long before I did. I know you were there, Sheila, but you're definitely one of them. So thanks for all your work. And I suppose what I've found is that in getting really involved in climate action and speaking for it and advocating for it as an athlete, that's probably, for me, I think helped my athletic performance. If I look at the length of my career, there's almost like a pre-COVID and post-COVID part of it, and certainly the results look a lot better post-COVID than pre-COVID, and I think some of that is just the journey as an athlete of, you're just getting started in the sport and trying to figure out whether you belong and just learn the sport and learn how to get good at performing on the big stage. Then I think also just having things that exist outside of your sport, for me, I think that just helps me, just feels like a better rounded person. And it does mean that, I'm not just having to focus on my sport 24/7, so that when something goes wrong, there's just a huge gaping hole in my sense of self. It does also give a little bit more meaning to my sport. I suppose I continued with my walking career past Little Athletics because I enjoyed it, and then kept going up to international level because I kept enjoying it, and travelling and meeting people from other countries is pretty fun. But feeling like there was a bit more to my sport than just the selfish, doing it because I enjoy it thing, I think has been really helpful. And especially as I'm getting probably towards the back half of my career, I think it's definitely helped with giving me a reason to get out of bed and keep doing it and just keep that career going.
Yeah, I think it's always the best excuse to play at the highest level and play, your best performances as well, because if you're speaking about things like climate, playing better on the field's always, or on the track or whatever the course is.
Right.
Yeah. I think that, it's just a great excuse to have the best career of your life if you want to speak about something like climate, which is obviously super important. Before I move on to Lex and Joe, I'd love to know if climate is something that both of you talk to your peers about, or talked to your peers about. If you did, what was that like? And if you don't, what are the reasons that you hold back from talking about your peers about something like climate?
I'll start. I did speak to my peers about it, but I think the important part of that is not all peers, and not necessarily, I wouldn't even frame that in a negative way. I think we focus so much on the ones who aren't on board that we forget that if we put our time to the people who are on board, that we can actually make real change. And that's not to say that you're not wanting to influence those who aren't quite there, but I think once we generated a player group that all had like-minded thoughts and were driven in the same way, that was when it started to feel like we were really capable of change. And they were the peers that I spent my time engaging with and really trying to brainstorm what we could actually do.
I guess there's times and places for different conversations to be had, and I guess part of the challenge is just trying to pick them and find them, but also not being too cautious and sort of leaving those conversations unhad. But I think something from the athletics perspective, World Athletics for the last bunch of years has been surveying their athletes at major championships about their attitudes towards climate change and climate action. And one of the things that they've found is that the vast majority, I'm thinking over 70% of athletes, firstly are concerned about climate change and then also feel like they've been impacted already by climate change. And so I feel like there's definitely, when you have the governing bodies doing things like that, it does help create space for those conversations, and also just breaks down that barrier of not being sure what other athletes think about it, because I guess sometimes you can feel like a little bit of an island and you're worried about things, but you don't know if anyone else is worried about the same things, and it's just really relieving to know that other people are feeling the same concerns about climate action, and that really creates space for those conversations. And then it's just a matter of finding those times to talk about it, or just introduce it into a conversation that you're already having. Like, for example, talking about the weather, it's amazing that we've had how many cloudless days in a row that's nice and warm, and everyone's like, oh, this is great, sunny days, not having to worry about being rained on randomly because it's Melbourne. But at the same time, you can have that conversation and be like, well, isn't it unusual that we've had so many dry days and it's such a dry start to autumn? That's just an example of how you can work climate into conversations that you might already be having, because here at Melbourne we love talking about the weather.
I'm learning that very, very quickly. I haven't seen a drop of rain since I moved down, so it's been nice. Joe, I'd love for you to talk a little bit to the room about Cricket for Climate, who you are, why you exist, and I guess just touching on Rhydian's point then, how you go about identifying athletes who do want to talk and be involved in climate action.
Yep. Hello, everybody, and spot the difference. I'm not the athlete, unfortunately, but it's lovely to be invited to speak. So Joe Bowen, CEO of Cricket for Climate. If you haven't heard of Cricket for Climate before, then we're a player-led movement that was founded by Australian Test captain Pat Cummins, who around about the same time as Nick and Rhydian and others are mentioning, started to really connect the dots between some of the things he experiences as a player, not just here in Australia, but in places like Bangladesh, where he loses 6.5 kilos in a day, with this thing called climate change. And having got the captaincy, was really keen to think about how he could use that leadership opportunity on the field, but also off the field. So we're a player-led movement started by Pat, with other kind of players jumping on board, and we collaborate with players, but we're also about grassroots community cricket. We're about working with crickets and other kind of partners who are connected, local and state government that are connected to cricket, and also globally through forums like the International Cricket Council and beyond. what are we doing? So 3 main parts of our strategy. I think importantly, and perhaps connected to this conversation about what helps athletes find confidence to speak, is our primary focus has always been to be impact-led. So rather than Pat, starting to talk about climate, he started this thing in a very practical way, which was to go back to his local grade club in Penrith, one of the hottest suburbs in Western Sydney, and put solar panels on his grade club. So very impact-led. That did 3 things. 1, it started to reduce the emissions connected to that particular community club. 2, it started to save money on energy bills that was then pumped back into that local game and community. And 3, because Pat showed up for a little bit of a PR and media launch and hordes of people came out, he found himself having quite different conversations with a relatively conservative audience. And so when you kind of look at that impact lens, it's an important one because we know how the media likes to chase and hound athletes, but they couldn't argue with that. He was actually getting on and getting the job done. So impact is a really huge focus for us. We're pushing bold energy, wastewater and nature-based solutions across the facilities of cricket here in Australia, in partnership with Cricket Australia and the state-based associations, and of course local councils who often own the land, and of course we intersect with other sports. So some of the projects that we've done are on cricket clubs, but also connected to AFL clubs that use the venues during the winter season. And we're really trying to push an agenda that isn't just reduction of emissions, but actually saving of money. In a cost of living crisis, we know that grassroots sports is doing it tough sometimes. So how do we save money? But in one of our recent projects here in Dandenong, we actually partnered with people to create brand new revenue streams for a cricket club in Dandenong. So they're now saving $7.5 to 10 grand a year. They're getting that by selling excess energy back to the grid, and that's going straight back into grassroots community cricket, into the women and girls participation program. So that's the impact side. Sorry, I spoke way too long on that. But I think it's important because it's easier for athletes to stand up against those projects and say, this is important for these reasons. The second part of the pillar really is the cultural influence of sport, and in particular, obviously cricket is our focus. 2.5 billion fans globally and 8 million here in Australia. And ironically, not ironically, but, factually, people aren't really listening much to politicians anymore. They want to listen to the scientists, but they don't speak the same language. But if you get an athlete like Rhydian or Nick or Emma in the important role that they're playing, then you've captured somebody's attention. So it's a massive cultural influence. And we've done research across Australian cricket fans that shows that they are more aware of climate than the general population. They are willing to listen. I think 70% said that if players took a role on this, they would consider following in the footsteps. That's an incredible, powerful platform to play in. And so we're working with the players, but also some of the club presidents to help them understand how they can start to have conversations that are normalised through the platform of cricket and start to take action in their own lives and within their own spheres of influence. Third part of what we're doing is just, we're a player-led movement. I'm not sure there's anything quite like us globally, so we've got a bit of an influencing role internationally as well, and work a lot with other sports. So that's a bit about who we are. You asked me about how do we get athletes?
Yeah, just thinking about how we identify and encourage athletes. I think one of the things we've spoken about before is that, and that you just referenced then, is that people don't want to listen to politicians all the time. They want to listen to people that they really look up to, and athletes often are those people. But sometimes athletes can feel really nervous about talking up about things because they have all the pressures that Emma and Rhydian were talking about of their sport. And I think we also feel a sense of, can I talk about this if I'm not a climate scientist? I know that's something that I've sort of had to work through a little bit. But at the end of the day, athletes, we're not climate scientists. We don't know anything about that. But we can listen to the experts and then be connected to things like Joe talks about, where we're putting solar panels on our local cricket club, or we're taking action, and we can really talk to those things in a way that's meaningful to us. So I think that's important. And the other thing, Joe, we have spoken about is, I guess, some athletes might feel like they don't have the platform that Pat Cummins has. Pat's hugely popular. He's the Australian cricket captain. But if, you've got under-19s players or young players in your team or in your sport who do really care about this stuff, how do you go about encouraging them to use their platform when they might feel nervous about doing it?
There's a lot in there. Look, I think it's not easy. You've heard here that there's a real desire for certain athletes to speak up on this, but there's also, I guess, a set of limitations or limiting beliefs around it. I think number one, you're not going to get every athlete. So we're all human. We all care about different issues. But where you're going to sort of get the wins is when you find somebody who's generally really interested in this, not to name names, but when I met David over here, who's one of our players that we've trained through our academy, the first conversation that we had was about the fact that he was into this way before we even met. So he'd been kind of having a go at this in various different ways. So I think go where the energy is, which I think is what you guys have said as well. So that's probably number one. I think number two is that we're absolutely not asking them to be the experts in the climate science, but we're normalising a conversation through cricket. And so our purpose actually at Cricket for Climate, it doesn't have climate in the title. It's actually about making sure that there is cricket forever by building resilience into the game and into the communities. And so for those players, and in particular the under-19s that we brought to our academy last year, they're on a pathway that they've really worked hard for and are quite excited about. And the minute we brought them into our academy and said, hey, perhaps the game's going to change, perhaps it's not going to be played the same way that you're familiar with, I've never seen people more fired up in my life, because they're like, well, from our perspective, we're just starting out and we want to play this game. And so, we now feel like we have an obligation to start to take action and to talk to some of our peers about this. So that's kind of them on the under-19 side of things and the younger side. And then sort of the more elite players that are perhaps starting to round out their careers, it matters for different reasons. So many of them have got young children, and so those kind of conversations are more about, well, perhaps my kids won't have the same opportunity that I took for granted. Like, we're Australians, we have the most incredible country, we take for granted that we can do amazing outdoor things, play sports, go to the beach, so on and so forth. And actually for the older players, it's more about how do I protect a future of the game and a future for my kids.
Yeah, I think we can't make athletes care, right? We've got to find what's important to them specifically and make it relatable to them, because that's when we're going to be speaking more authentically and passionately about climate, if we can find, I guess, something that relates to our lives. Lex, you've been at Footy for Climate for 6 months now. I know you're a massive North Melbourne fan as well. What has surprised you, I guess, the most about working with athletes so far? And I'd love for you to talk to the room a little bit about what Footy for Climate's up to as well.
Thanks, Nick. And I did see some of the faces there when you mentioned North Melbourne, and you were kind of looking at me with care.
Collective sigh.
We are the AFLW reigning premiers. Look, we've been going for about 4 or 5 years. As Nick mentioned, it was set up by AFL and AFLW players. I think for myself, having been involved in sort of the broader climate and sustainability space, working with local government or climate advocacy organisations over that period of time, it's challenging to, build movements. And then you sort of come into this AFL space and this broader footy community space, and the potential and the power there is just incredible. It is the biggest, I would argue, cultural institution in Australia. You've probably got sport, and then certainly in the footy playing states, footy and sport is that sort of cultural touch piece. Like, I walk in here today, and even the MCG with no one out there, for me, I just sort of feel this kind of, buzz inside me. And I think the way that we can potentially use that emotional connection is something that we have a lot of power to do. I've got a 14-year-old daughter, and she's a peak teenager at the moment. And the other day she said to me, "Dad, what's the saddest movie you've ever seen?" And I was like, I don't know. So what about, a recent sad movie that you've seen? And I thought about the film Lion, about that kid, the Indian kid that gets lost on the railways in India and comes to Australia. And it's really heart-wrenching. And I said, look, I think that's probably the last time I cried in a movie. And then there was a discussion about why, blokes don't generally cry and all that sort of gender stuff. And I said, I don't know, I just don't really cry that much. And she just looked at me impassively and just said, "Dad, you cried when North beat West Coast last year." And this was the 0-12 North Melbourne male team. And I was keeping it together as we won our first game for the year. And that's so real, though. And I think even though, I'm so wrapped by the AFLW premiership that North won last year, and I would love to have seen more North premierships over the journey, but I'm so proud of what they can do and what sport can do from that social change side of things. The huddle. When Danny Laidley comes back to the club with her arms around, Jack Siebel and Boomer Harvey, and what that's going to do to trans kids around Australia, what the Richmond Footy Club have done with their Sustainability Action Plan, or Freo and their Reconciliation Action Plan. Like, it is just, it's just phenomenally powerful. Climate change is the next frontier. It's not the last one, but it's certainly the most critical one. And so what we want to do is use that power of footy to sort of, get in and connect and have those conversations.
Yeah, wonderful. And you're doing some amazing work, Lex, so keep an eye out on Footy for Climate. Emma and Rhydian, I'd love to come back to you about some of the, to tell the room a little bit about what has made it easier specifically for you both to speak up about climate action. Is it organisations like Cricket for Climate and Footy for Climate, or the PFA? Is it, making sure that your club is supportive of what you do? Is it your peers? Love to know a little bit about what's made it easier for you to speak about things like climate.
Oh, I guess I'll start this time. I suppose there's a few different enablers. Definitely, having FrontRunners, Sports Environment Alliance, eco-athletes as groups where I guess it's almost like particularly with FrontRunners and eco-athletes, almost like a peer network for athletes that care about climate change. It definitely makes it feel a little bit easier, because suddenly you're with a group, you're not just standing out there in the spotlight by yourself. And it's also, that's just a great way to sort of share knowledge, especially if you feel like you're starting out and you're not sure if you know enough to say anything. And I guess it also helps you get over a little bit of that feeling of being hypocritical as well, which can sometimes be a little bit of a barrier. I suppose it's been nice as well to sometimes have those connection pieces with other athletes within my sport, or other athletes within the Victorian Institute of Sport where I train at, and just sort of recognise again that I'm not alone. And then having the resources and campaigns like FrontRunners often putting forward things for me to join, and I'm like, all right, I'll put my hand up for that.
Rhydian's always the first one to put his hand up, so we're very grateful.
I just love being involved.
You do.
I guess having, I suppose sometimes as an athlete, if you're going to your sports governing body and saying hey, can you do stuff? You're asking them, but you're not a decision maker. You don't have any control over funding or anything like that. So I guess using your voice is definitely one thing that you can do. But then having campaigns to join on also does help. We're not all Pat Cummins and able to put solar panels on our local cricket clubs. So finding something where we can feel like we're taking action outside of, I guess, whatever's in our own life, I think is really important, and it does also build that confidence in, I guess, what you're doing. And also, I guess I've heard then sometimes people coming back to me and being like, oh, I really love what you're doing or what you're talking about, and sort of getting that positive feedback of, I guess, realising that people are listening to you, and that, that sport really does have that cultural influence, I think is really helpful at building up that confidence and being like, yes, I'm going to keep speaking about climate action because I am making a difference. You know, sometimes you don't always feel like you're making a difference, but getting that feedback really does help reinforce that you are.
Yeah, awesome. And I think that peer-to-peer support is so important. One of the campaigns Rhydian's speaking about is FrontRunners' most recent campaign, the Duty of Care campaign. And one of the athletes we ended up having come on board was Mick Fanning posting about the Duty of Care campaign, which was unreal. But it wouldn't have happened if one of the athletes that we work really close with, Ace Buchan, who's another ex-professional surfer, reached out to Mick directly and said, hey, this is something I think you'd love to get on board with. Come and join us. So I think don't underestimate the ability for athletes to speak to other athletes. Like, it just makes it feel so much safer. Emma, I know with the Green Games, the PFA obviously gave you so much support, and we're really keen to help out the players that were passionate about this. What's the role do you think of players' associations and sports clubs in supporting athletes to do this work?
Yeah, I think they play a massive role in this space. I know that we would never have been able to get those games off the ground if it weren't for the PFA, and I think often the player unions and the clubs can, carry the weight with these issues in a way that the leagues and bigger organisations don't often put the time and energy into prioritising them. But I think in saying that, it's a great opportunity for the unions, the clubs and the players to actually take a stance and do something for themselves. And I think what we've seen is that there can be great impact even if it starts small. And one of the messages that we always focused on was small change is big change, and I think Rhydian focused on it as well. It's easy to question yourself on how much change you're actually creating, and especially when resources are limited. Not all sports, clubs, organisations, whatever it be, have the resourcing to have those big impactful changes. And I think for us it was, well, if we start small, we're at least getting the ball rolling, and you can always go up from there. It's about setting a foundation that you can't go back from. So I think even a little step is a big step because it means you've made one, and it's worse to go backwards than it is to make a small step forwards.
Absolutely. And I think with sports clubs, I know there's a lot of sports administrators here today, athletes can be our biggest asset. So if you're doing amazing work, get the athletes on board. We want to know what our clubs are doing. I know for me at the Giants, who were doing a lot of sustainability work, I was like, tell me about it, because then I can go and talk about it, because I don't have to go talk about the climate science, which I'm questioning myself on. I can actually talk about the great work that you're doing. So I think it's, Joe talked a lot about linking athletes to actionable things that are happening. It makes it so much easier for us to speak out. Lex and Joe, love to know if you had any thoughts to add around how the broader sports industry can make it easier for athletes to speak up.
Look, I think you've touched on it. So the first thing is to listen to you guys. I'm also on the non-athlete side here, and so I think we're lucky at Footy because we've got the players that have started it, and so we can tap into those networks. And so I'd probably be echoing a lot of what's been said, so making sure that we, all of us, so whether it's sporting bodies, organisations like Footy for Climate, the clubs, the codes, meeting athletes where they are. And this is what happens in broader, change-making or sustainability or climate circles. You meet people where they are. I think the point about that tangible projects that you can actually get your hands on is really important too. So we're copying a lot of what cricket did. We've got our player engagement strategy, which is making sure that we can build their capacity, teach them, amplify their stories, make sure they've got coverage, but also something around the footy community, like putting solar on roofs or going out with Pete from earlier, and doing something like that and having something you can attach yourself to so you don't get caught in the hypocrisy trap. And I think the other thing is, even, in a broader society, one thing that we've found, which was this little kind of hidden superpower even, is political engagement. And so for athletes to know that there's this other, there's this other world here, but when you've got sporting people and athletes in the room with decision makers like politicians, the whole dynamic kind of changes. And so we had an event a couple of months ago where Emma Carney, AFL Premiership captain and star, came and ran this community forum in Hamilton in the lead up to the election, and it was talking about protecting the future of the game. Again, you can hear the themes around the language that we use. It's all about the things that we care about, protecting the future of the game, getting that messaging right. But by bringing footy to the table, we've got the members of Parliament from Wannon, Dan Tehan, the Alex Dyson Independent, coming to a climate event, but it's under the guise of footy. And we also last year had this event at Vic Parliament where we set up a locker room between the two halls of Parliament and had, Tom Campbell and Nick, you were there, players talking about the impacts of the game, how much you love your club. And so politicians, again, just walking past. And I remember talking to someone, an organisation that we work closely with, Environmental Leadership Australia, saying, if you can get 3 or 4 people, MPs, to come to an event like that, you're doing really well. And their maximum ever was 12. And the locker room had 80. Because you've just got this safe space to talk about climate. And I think we eventually do need bipartisanship. And I think hopefully that's something that can make players support them to realise that you're in a safe space and we've got the power potentially to try and really lean into that and make it a safe space to talk about.
Anything from you, Joe? Before we wrap up, I'm conscious of time.
Sorry, I've only got 3 quick points. One, money talk. So I think, sports are business and everybody's looking to grow in sports, and sustainability and climate change is absolutely core to that strategy. So it poses risks, number one, so you need to mitigate that, but it also, from a growth perspective, creates brand new commercial opportunities for sporting organisations and competitions. So I think that's one thing that sporting bodies can start to change the narrative around. My second point was really to understand that athletes are both on and off the field, and so to think about them more holistically and to think about this as an opportunity to build around an athlete and to acknowledge that potentially there is an individual value creation associated to that as well is probably a big one as well. And then the third point is just choose your own adventure. So for some of these athletes, they may want to go down the political path. I haven't found too many of those in my work so far, but for others, they're more interested in the climate tech or they're more interested in nature. And so it's not going to look the same for everybody, but, working with them on an individual basis and saying, hey, what's that particular area you're interested in? How can we help you learn more? How can we then normalise that through, people that you start to have conversations with is the best way to start, I think.
Yeah, and I think Pat Cummins actually became the most marketable athlete in the world or in Australia after Cricket for Climate was started. So it just goes to show how much potential this area has for athletes. I promised questions. I don't think we have time. We're going to throw all the panellists under the bus and say that they're going to be around, so come and ask some questions. But just to wrap, I think we often talk about athletes being role models, but at the end of the day, we all have the same anxiety as the rest of the world about the future. But when we can support athletes with clarity and courage and care, we can really help them on this journey and they can help to shift entire cultures. So thank you so much, everyone, and looking forward to the rest of the day.
Thank you so much. A big round of applause, please, for Nick, Joe, Lex, Em and Rhydian. Great to have you here.